Chapter 9 of In the Footprints of the Padres by Charles Warren Stoddard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, An Affair of the Misty City. 2. What the Sun Shone On. He shone on the far side of the eastern azure hills, and set all the tree-tops in the wood beyond the wold aflame. He looked over the silhouette out of a cloudless sky upon a bay whose breadth and beauty is one of the 700 wonders of the world. He paved the waves with gold, a path celestial that angels might not fear to tread. He touched the heights of the Misty City and the sea fog that had walled it in through the night as with walls of unquarried marble, albeit the eaves had dripped in the darkness as after a summer shower, and anon the opaque vapors dissolved and fled away. There she lay, the Misty City, in all her wasted and scattered beauty. She might have been a picture for poets to dream on and artists to love, their wonder and their despair. But she is not. She is hideous to look upon, save in the sunset or the afterglow, when you cannot see her, but only the dim vision of what she might have been. He rose as a god refreshed with sleep, and called the weary to their work, and disturbed the slumbers of those that toil not and spin not, and have nothing to do but sleep. There were no secrets from him now. Every detail was discovered, and so, having gilded for a moment the mossy shingles of the eyrie, he stole into the room where Paul Clitheroe passed most of his waking hours, and through the curtain of ivy and geraniums that screened the conservatory from the eyes of the curious world, and where Paul was at this moment sleeping the sleep of the just. From the bed of the ravine below the eyrie rose the rumble and roar of traffic. The hours passed by. The sleeper began to turn uneasily on his pillow. The sound of hurrying feet was heard upon the boardwalks in front of the Erie cliff. Many voices, youthful voices, swelled the chorus that told of the regiments of children now hastening to school. From dreamland Paul returned by easy stages to the workaday world. He arose, donned a trailing garment with angel sleeves, and a large crucifix embroidered in scarlet upon the breast. That robe made of him a cross between a monk and a marchioness, and slipped his feet into sandals, and entered the larger chamber which was at once living room and library. He opened the shutters in the deep bay window, and greeted the day with the silent solemnity of a fire worshipper, gave drink to his potted palms and ferns and flowering plants, let his eye wander leisurely over the titles of his books, lingered a little while over his favorites, and patted some of them fondly on the back. Taking a small key from its nail by the door, he opened the mail-box without, carrying his letters to his writing-table, and leaving them there unopened. He loved to speculate as to whom the writers were and what they may have said to him. This piqued his curiosity, and tided him over a scant breakfast at an inexpensive but fly-blown restaurant, where he was wont to eat, or make a more or less brave effort to eat whenever he had the wherewithal to settle for the same. Breakfast over and gone, the young man returned to his eyrie, and in due course was at his writing-table, and at work upon the weekly article that had been appearing in the Sunday issue of one of the popular dailies for an indefinite period, and the price of which had on several occasions kept him from becoming a conspicuous object of charity. Having written himself out for the day, as he was apt to do in a few hours, he wandered down to the club for a bit of refreshment, which was sure to be forthcoming, for his friends there were ever ready to dine him, or more frequently to wine him, merely for the pleasure of his company. So the afternoon waned, and the dinner hour approached. Fortunately, this hour was usually bespoken, and for a little while at least he was lapped in luxury. On his way home he was very apt to turn in at the wicker gates of a typical German Ratskeller, where he was unmolested, where the blustering pipes of a colossal orchestrion brayed through an aria from Il Trovatore with more sound than sentiment, and all unmindful of modulation. He was at home by midnight, for the beer and the bravura ceased to flow at the witching hour. Then he lounged in the easy-chair, gradually and not unconsciously shedding all the worldly influences that had been clothing him as with a hair-shirt ever since he first went forth that morning. Safely he sank into the silence of the place. Every breath he drew was balm, every moment healing. So he passed into the silence, enfolded by invisible arms that led him gently to his pillow, where he sank to sleep with the trustful resignation of a tired babe. If this routine was ever varied, it was a variation with a vengeance. From grave to gay, from lively to severe, might have been engraved upon his escutcheon. It chanced that the family motto was Festina Lonte. This also was appropriate, had he not all his life made haste slowly. For this very reason he had been accounted one of the laziest of his kind. His indolence was a byword, merely because he did not throw himself into an easy-chair at the club of an evening and bewail his fate; because he did not puff and blow and talk often of the work he had accomplished, was accomplishing, or hastening forward to accomplishment. With all his faults, thank Heaven, that sin cannot be charged against him. End of Chapter 9, Part 2. Chapter 9 of In the Footprints of the Padres, by Charles Warren Stoddard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, An Affair of the Misty City. 3. Balm of Hurt Wounds. He was scrimping in every way. His case was growing desperate. The books, the pictures, the bric-a-brac so precious in his eyes, he was loath to part with. Moreover, he was well aware that if he were to trundle his effects down to an auction-room, they would not bring him enough to cover his expenses for a single week. Better to starve in the midst of my household gods, thought he, than to part with them for the sake of prolonging this misery. The situation was in some respects serio-comic. While he seemed to have everything, he really had almost nothing. He was in a certain sense at the mercy of his friends and dependent upon them. As the dinner hour approached, Paul was called upon to make choice of the character of his table talk. There were several standing invitations to dine at the houses of old friends, and these were a boon to him, for at such houses the homeless fellow felt much at home. There were special invitations, sometimes an embarrassing profusion of them, all kindly, some persistent, and some even imperative. Thus the dinner was a fixed fact. The mood alone was to be consulted in his choice of a table, and after all, how much of the success of a dinner depends upon the mood of the diner? Paul's income was uncertain. While he had written much and traveled much as a special correspondent, he had never regularly connected himself with any journal, and he knew nothing of the routine of office work. Sometimes, I may say, not infrequently, he could not write at all. Yet his pen was his only source of revenue, and often he was without a copper to his credit. He was therefore constrained to dine sumptuously with friends, when he would have found a solitary salad a sweet alternative, and independence far more acceptable. The state of the exchequer was very often alarming, and his predicament might have cast a stronger man into the depths. But Paul could fast without complaint when necessary, for he had fasted often. And to confess the truth, he would much rather have fasted on and on than parted with any of the little souvenirs that made his surroundings charming in spite of his privations. The friends who loved and fondled him were wont to send messengers to his door with gifts of flowers, books, pictures, and the like, when soup tickets would have been more serviceable, though by no means more acceptable. It had happened to him more than once that having failed to break his fast, for he had a judicious horror of debt, born of bitter experience, he received at a late hour, as tokens of sincere interest in his welfare, scarf pins, perfumery, and scented soap. Or it may have been a silk handkerchief bearing the richly wrought monogram of the happy but hungry recipient. At any rate, these testimonials of his popularity were never edible. Was this hard luck? He went from one swell dinner to another, day after day, with never so much as a crumb between meals. It, of course, made some difference to him, this prolonged abstinence, but fortunately, or unfortunately, the effect upon him mentally, morally, and physically was hardly visible to the naked eye. He had a dress coat of the strictly correct type, which he had worn but a few times. He had lectured in it. Once or twice he had recited poems in it to the audiences of admiring lady friends. It was of no use to him now, and he felt that he should never need it again. On the street below him was a small shop, kept by the customary Israelite. Again and again Paul had noted the sun-faded frock coat swinging from a hook over the sidewalk in front of this shop. He had said, "I will take this coat to him. It is a costly garment. Divide the original price of it by the number of times I have worn it, and I find it has cost me about $10 an evening. Perhaps this old clothes dealer will pay me a fair price for it. Jew though he be, he may be possessed of the heart of a Christian." Alas and alack, all of Clitheroe's sufferings could be traced to the cool, calculating hardness of the Christian's heart. Probably it was prejudice alone that caused him to trust the Christian and distrust the Jew. From day to day he passed the shop, striving to muster courage enough to enter and propose his bargain. At first he had imagined the dealer offering him but $10 for the coat. It had cost him a goodly sum. A little later he concluded that $10 was too little for any one to offer him. He might take 20. A day later, 30 seemed to him a probable offer, and shortly after he imagined himself consenting to receive $50, since the coat was in such admirable repair. One day he took it to the dealer. He was not cordially welcomed by the man in shirt-sleeves, with whom of late he had held innumerable imaginary conversations. The shop was extremely small and dark. The odor of dead garments pervaded it. With an earnest and kindly glance, Paul invited the sympathy of Abraham, the son of Moses, who was the son of Isaac. He saw nothing but speculation in those eyes. His coat was examined and tossed aside, as possessing few attractions. Clitheroe's heart sank within him, and it sank deeper and deeper as it began to dawn upon him that the Hebrew had no wish to possess the garment, and if he did so, he did so only to oblige the Christian youth. A bargain was at last struck. Paul departed with $5 in his pocket. His dress coat was a thing of the past. What could he do next to extricate himself from his dubious dilemma? He had a small gold watch, a precious souvenir. "Gold is gold," said he, "and worth its weight in gold." He had the address of one who was known far and wide as Uncle. He had heard of persons of the highest respectability seeking this uncle when close pressed, and there finding temporary relief at the hands of one who is in some respect a good Samaritan in disguise. Paul found it absolutely impossible for him to enter the not unattractive front of this establishment, but there was a private entrance in a small, dark alleyway, so delicate is the consideration of an uncle whose business it is to nourish those in distress. One night, it was late at night, Clitheroe stole guiltily in through the private entrance and sought succor of his uncle. This was an unctuous uncle, who was as sympathetic and emotional as an undertaker. Paul exhibited his watch. Not for worlds would he part with it forever. Money he must have at once, and surely some good angel would come to his assistance before many days. This state of affairs could not exist much longer. Mine uncle examined the watch with kindly eyes. With a pathetic shake of his head, a pitiful lifting of his bushy eyebrows, a commiserating shrug of his fat shoulders, and a petulant pursing of his plump lips, as much as to say, "Well, it is a pity, but we must make the best of it, you know." He told Clitheroe he would advance him $10 on the watch. For this the boy was to pay $1 per week, and in the end receive his watch as good as new for the sum of $10 as originally advanced. Paul hesitated, but consented, since he had no choice in the matter. "What name?" asked the uncle benevolently. "P. Clitheroe," said Paul under his breath, as if he feared the whole world might know of his disgrace. He looked upon this transaction as nothing short of disgrace, and he wished to keep it a profound secret. "Oh, yes, I know the name very well. Well, Mr. Clitheroe, here is your ticket. Take good care of it. And here is your money. You will always pay your money in advance and weekly until you redeem your pledge. I deduct the $1 for the first week." Clitheroe took the proffered money and withdrew. To his surprise and chagrin, he found himself possessed of but $9. "It will not go far," thought he with a heavy sigh, "and where is the $1 to come from? I don't see that I have gained much by this exchange." What he gained was this. For 15 weeks he managed by the strictest economy to pay his $1. At the end of that time he no longer found it possible to even pay $1, and the affair with the uncle ended with his having lost not only his watch, but $16 into the bargain. A month has passed. The sun is streaming through the tall, narrow windows of a small chapel. The air is flooded with the music that floats from the organ loft, the solemn strains of a requiem chanted by sweet boy voices. Clouds of fragrant incense half obscure the altar, where the priest in black vestments is offering the solemn sacrifice of the Mass for the repose of the soul of one whom Paul had loved dearly ever since he was a child. There is one chief mourner kneeling before the altar. It is Paul Clitheroe. When the Mass is over, while the exquisite silence of the place is broken only by the occasional note of some bird lodging in the branches of the trees without, Paul lingers in profound meditation. He is not at all the Paul whom we knew but a few months ago. Through some mysterious influence he seems to have cast off his careless youth, and to have become a grave and thoughtful man. From the chapel he wanders into the quiet library on the opposite side of a cloister, where the flowers grow in tangle, and a fountain splashes musically night and day, and the birds build, and the bees swarm among the blossoms. Now we see him chatting with the Fathers as they stroll up and down in the sunshine, now musing over the graves of the Franciscan friars who founded the early missions on the coast, now dreaming in the ruins of the orchard, wandering always apart from the novices and the scholastics, who sometimes regard him curiously, as if he were not wholly human, but a kind of shadow haunting the place. His heart grew warm and mellow as he sat by the adobe wall under the red-baked Spanish tiles, richly mossed with age, and contemplated the statue of the Madonna in the trellised shrine overgrown with passion flowers. There were votive offerings of flowers at her feet, and he laid his tribute there from day to day. Neither did he neglect to pay his visit to the shrine of St. Joseph in the cloister, or St. Anthony of Padua, whom he loved best of all, and whose statue stood under the willows by the great pool of goldfish. He used to count the hours and the quarter hours as they chimed in the belfry, and he was beginning to grow fond of the inexorable routine and to find it passing sweet and restful. He was unconsciously falling into a mode of life such as he had never known before, and he seemed to feel a growing repugnance to the world without him. How very far away it seemed now! He realized an increasing sense of security so long as he lodged within those gates. His dark-robed companions, the amiable Fathers, cheered him, comforted him, strengthened him, and yet when his ghostly father one day sent word to Clitheroe that he desired to see him immediately, and thereupon insisted that the heartbroken boy accompany him to the retreat of his order, he had no thought other than to offer Paul the change of scene which alone might help to tide the youth over the first crushing pangs of bereavement. "Give me a week or two of your time," pleaded the good priest, "and I will introduce you to a course of life such as you have never known. It should interest and perhaps benefit you. Possibly you may find it delightful. At any rate, you must be hastened out of the morbid mood which now possesses you, even if we have to drag you by force." So Paul went with him, suddenly and in a kind of desperation. His visit was prolonged from day to day, until some weeks had passed. Peace was returning to him, peace such as he had never known before. Meanwhile, certain of the young poet's friends had called to see him at the Erie, and to their amazement found his rooms deserted. In the staring bay window, with the inner blinds thrown wide open, was notice "To Let." His landlady knew nothing of his whereabouts. He had said good-bye to no one. His disappearance was perhaps the most mysterious of mysterious disappearances. Now, what really happened was this. Having packed everything he valued and seen it safely stored, he settled with his landlady and went down to the club. It was his P.P.C., though no one there suspected it, and with just a touch of sentiment, he walked through the rooms alone. He saw at a glance that the usual habitués of the place were employing themselves in the same old way. Though he had not been there often of late, no one seemed much surprised to see him. He passed through the suite of rooms without addressing himself to any one in particular. A glance of recognition here and there, a smile, a slight nod now and again, this was all. Having made the rounds, he returned to the cloak-room, took his hat and cane, and departed. From that hour dated his disappearance. From that hour the Erie saw him no more forever. End of Chapter 9, Part 3. Chapter 9 of In the Footprints of the Padres by Charles Warren Stoddard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, An Affair of the Misty City. 4. By the World Forgot. For a long while he had been listening to the moan of the sea, the wail and the warning that rise from every reef in that wild waste of waters. There was no moon, but the large stars cast each a wake upon the wave, and the distant surf lines were faintly illuminated by a phosphorescent glow. There were reefs on every hand, and treacherous currents that would have imperiled the ribs of any craft depending on the winds alone for its salvation. But the Waring, its pulse of steam throbbing with a slow, measured beat, picked its way in the glimmering night with a confidence that made light of dangers past, present, and to come. It had struck 8 bells forward, midnight. The air was warm, moist, caressing. It stole forth from invisible, but not far distant vales laden with the unmistakable odor of the land, a fragrance that was at times faint enough, but at other times was almost overwhelming. From the heart of the tropics only, as such perfume distilled. Few who inhale it for the first time can resist its subtle charm. Its influence once yielded to, the soul is soon enslaved, and the dreams that follow are never to be forgotten. 8 bells, and silence, broken only by the swish of the propeller as it plowed slowly, deliberately, through the sea, the slap of the ripples under the prow, and an occasional harp-like sigh of the zephyr in the softly vibrating shrouds. Paul Clitheroe had stolen out of the cabin and was sitting by the companionway on the port side. A small ladder still hung there, for there had been boating and bathing just before dinner, and there was sure to be more or less fishing whenever the weather was favorable. Moreover, it must be acknowledged that the yacht was Liberty Hall afloat, yes, adrift on a go-as-you-please cruise, and things were not always in ship-shape. An old half-breed trader, who knew these seas as the stargazer knows the skies, was in the wheelhouse. Every wakeful eye among officers and crew was at the prow, peering into the depths in search of danger signals. Every ear was listening intently for an order from the lips of the pilot, and for the first whisper of the wave upon the reef. Meanwhile the vessel crept forward with utmost caution, barely ruffling the water under her keel. 1 bell, 2 bells. Clitheroe had for a long time been sitting unobserved by the companionway. He had dined with a riotous company, and withdrew as soon after dinner as possible. This privilege was freely accorded him, for he was at intervals gloomy or silent, and his companions were quite willing to dispense with his society. Hilarity had ceased for the night. The fact was patent. The truth is, there was apt to be something too much of it aboard that ship. When a young gentleman, on the death of a distant relative, comes suddenly into an almost fabulous fortune, he is apt to set about doing that which pleases him best. In all probability he overdoes it. If he be fond of any society, and is willing to pay for the purchase of it, he will find no difficulty in supplying himself, even to the verge of satiety. A certain gentleman, who shall be nameless in these pages, but who came to be known among his followers as the Commodore, finding himself heir to a fortune, chartered a yacht for a summer cruise, and invited his friends to join him. The yacht had been for some weeks the scene of unceasing festivity. The joyous party on board her had passed from island to island, the fêted guests of kings and queens and dusky chiefs. Feasting, dancing, and the exchange of gifts, these were the order of entertainment night and day. It was a novel life for most who were on board, filled with adventure and spectacular surprises. The Commodore's hospitality was boundless, the appetites of his guests insatiable. But Clitheroe had seen all this from quite another point of view. He had been a native among the natives. Admitted into brotherhood with the tribe, he had lived the life they led until it had become as natural to him as if he had been born to it. Their thoughts were his thoughts, their tongue his tongue. He was thinking of this as he sat by the companionway, in the silence, unobserved. 3 bells. He rose, and going to the open transom, looked down into the cabin. The long dinner table had been relieved of dessert dishes, but the after-dinner bottles were there in profusion, and cigar boxes and cigarettes within convenient reach. It was an odd scene, a picture of confusion in a dead calm. The lights were burning low, and there was no sound save the hoarse breathing of some of the revellers, who had subsided into uncomfortable positions and were too heavy with sleep to seek easier ones. Clitheroe saw at the head of the table the Commodore, stretched back in his easy-chair. He was fast asleep. There was no doubt about that. His guests, one and all, were dozing. The drowsy stupor that follows a debauch pervaded the whole company. I ventured the assurance that not one person present could have been aroused in season to save himself or herself had the ship at that moment struck a reef and foundered. There they were, dimly outlined under the cabin lamps, the companions with whom for a season Clitheroe had been more or less intimately associated in the Misty City, the Bohemians who had found it an easy and pleasant thing to flock upon the deck of the Waring one foggy afternoon and set sail on a summer cruise. The Commodore invited them for his entertainment, and because he was a mighty good fellow and could afford to. They went for a change of air and scene, in search of adventure, and moreover they were sure of luxurious hospitality for at least 6 months. Clitheroe joined the company, not only for the reason that there seemed nothing else for him to do, but he was glad of the opportunity of revisiting a quarter of the globe so very dear to him. This voyage, he thought, might reawaken his interest in life. At any rate, he could lose nothing by taking it, and that settled the question for him. The singers, the dancers, the painters, and poets made life very lively in that summer sea. It was a case of sweet idleness, with wine, women, and wits, and all the world before them where to choose. It must be confessed that Clitheroe had enjoyed himself in the society of these old comrades. You would recognize most of them were he to name them. But tonight, or rather this early morning, he had begun to moralize, as he peered down the transom upon the half-shadowy forms of those feasters who had fallen by the way. He was asking himself if it paid, this high-pressure happiness that knew no respite save temporary insensibility. He began to think that it did not, and with a shrug of his shoulders and a faint sigh, he turned away. He was about to resume his solitary watch, for he could not sleep on such a night, when his eye was attracted by a flitting shadow weaving to and fro astern. It seemed to be soaring upon the face of the waters. Was it some broad-winged sea-bird following in their wake? He watched it as it drew near, growing larger and larger every moment. No, it was not a bird, but it was the next thing to one. Out of the darkness was evolved the slender hull of a canoe, the wide, many-ribbed sail, and the dusky forms of 3 naked islanders. They had not yet taken note of him. With a sudden impulse, he stole up to the transom, and, standing over it so that the lights from the cabin lamps shone full upon him, he waved a signal to the savages, enjoining silence, and bidding them approach with caution. In a few moments they had wafted themselves noiselessly up under the companion ladder, and there, with suppressed excitement, he was recognized. Old friends these, pals in the past, young chiefs from an island he had loved and mourned. There was a moment of passionate greeting, and but a moment, in the silence under the stars. Then, with a sudden resolve, and with never a glance backward, Clitheroe, descending the ladder, entered the canoe, and it swung off into the night. 2 hours later, the Waring, having run clear of the labyrinthine reefs, steamed up, and was out of sight before daybreak. And what is left? Dust and ash and a tail. Or not even a tail. Marcus Aurelius. End of Chapter 9, Part 4. End of In the Footprints of the Padres.